Part 1. The watching begins. The morning sun cast long shadows across Cedar Ridge as Daniel Walker stepped out of his black pickup truck. His boots hit the dusty ground with a familiar thud, the same sound that had echoed through this small town every Saturday for the past 5 years. Daniel owned the biggest cattle ranch in 3 counties, stretching over 10,000 acres of rolling hills and green pastures. His great-grandfather had started with just 50 acres and a dream. Now the Walker name meant something in these parts, but success had its price. The big house on the hill felt empty most days. Sure, it had 8 bedrooms, a grand staircase, and windows that looked out over land as far as the eye could see. Yet Daniel found himself eating dinner alone most nights, listening to nothing but the wind through the oak trees. This particular Saturday started like any other. Daniel needed supplies for the ranch, and Miller's General Store had been serving the Walker family for 3 generations. Old Pete Miller knew exactly what Daniel needed before he even asked. Fence wire, cattle feed, and those special nails that worked best in the hard cedar posts. As Daniel walked toward the store, something caught his eye. A woman stood near the wooden steps, holding the hand of a little girl with pigtails. 2 boys, maybe 8 and 10 years old, stayed close to their mother's side. The woman looked tired, the kind of tired that goes deeper than just needing sleep. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her dress, though clean and pressed, had seen better days. The woman was counting coins in her palm, her lips moving silently as she added up the numbers. Daniel watched as she looked at a small piece of paper, then back at the coins. Her shoulders sagged a little, and she put some of the coins back in her purse. She whispered something to her children, and Daniel could see the disappointment in their young faces. He didn't mean to stare, but something about the scene made him pause. The woman handled the situation with such grace. She smiled at her children, ruffled the youngest boy's hair, and spoke to them in a voice that was gentle and reassuring. Even though Daniel couldn't hear the words from where he stood, he could see love in every gesture. The family walked up the steps into Miller's store. Daniel followed a few minutes later, pretending to examine the display of work gloves near the entrance. From the corner of his eye, he watched the woman move through the aisles. She picked up items carefully, checking prices twice before putting anything in her basket. The children stayed quiet and well-behaved, not asking for candy or toys like most kids their age would. At the counter, Pete Miller greeted the woman with the kind of warmth reserved for longtime customers. Her name was Rebecca, Daniel learned, Rebecca Hayes. Pete asked about her oldest boy's schoolwork and complimented the little girl's new haircut. It was clear this family belonged in Cedar Ridge, even if times were tough. When Pete totaled up Rebecca's groceries, she looked at the amount and quietly asked him to remove a few items. Bread, milk, and some apples stayed. Everything else went back. Daniel's chest tightened watching this. He'd never had to choose between necessities. The Walker Ranch provided more than enough for any luxury he might want. After Rebecca and her children left, Daniel approached the counter. Pete looked troubled, shaking his gray head as he organized the returned items. "Shame about Rebecca Hayes," Pete muttered, more to himself than to Daniel. "Good woman. Husband died in that mining accident over in Clearwater about 6 months back. Left her with 3 kids and a mountain of medical bills from when he was in the hospital. She's been trying to make ends meet with odd jobs, but it ain't easy." Daniel nodded, processing this information. He'd heard about the mining accident. A cave-in had trapped 5 men. Only 2 survived, and one of those had been David Hayes. He'd lived for 3 weeks in the county hospital before his injuries became too much. The whole thing had been tragic, but Daniel hadn't connected it to the woman he'd just watched. Over the following weeks, Daniel found himself timing his trips to town differently. Instead of his usual early morning visits, he came later in the day. He told himself it was because the weather was cooler, or because he had more time after handling ranch business. But deep down, he knew the real reason. He wanted to see if Rebecca Hayes was doing okay. She was there most Saturdays, and sometimes on Wednesday afternoons. Always with at least one of her children, always counting coins, always making careful choices about what she could afford. Daniel began to learn her patterns. She shopped for groceries every 2 weeks. She bought the children new school supplies only when absolutely necessary. She never bought anything for herself. One afternoon, Daniel saw Rebecca and her daughter outside the post office. The little girl's shoes had holes in them, and Rebecca was kneeling down, trying to make them more comfortable with some newspaper. It was such a simple thing, but it hit Daniel harder than he expected. Here was a mother doing everything she could to take care of her child with whatever resources she had. That evening, Daniel sat on his porch looking out over his land. Cattle grazed peacefully in the distance. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was beautiful, but for the first time in years, Daniel felt restless. He had all this space, all this wealth, and yet he felt like something was missing. He thought about Rebecca Hayes, about the way she smiled at her children even when things were difficult. He thought about how she never seemed bitter or angry, just tired and determined. There was something special about her, something that made her stand out from everyone else in Cedar Ridge. Daniel had dated a few women over the years, mostly daughters of other ranch owners or women from the state capital who were impressed by his money. But none of those relationships had felt real. They liked the idea of Daniel Walker, the successful rancher, but they didn't seem to care much about Daniel the man. Rebecca was different. She probably didn't even know who he was beyond recognizing him as someone who shopped at the same store. She wasn't trying to impress anyone or get anything from anyone. She was just trying to survive and take care of her family. As the weeks passed, Daniel found himself thinking about Rebecca more often. He wondered how she was managing, whether her children had enough warm clothes for the approaching winter, if she was getting enough to eat herself. He'd never felt this kind of concern for someone he barely knew. The other ranchers and business owners in town sometimes talked about the Hayes situation. Most felt sorry for her, but in that distant way, people feel sorry for strangers in the news. A few mentioned that she should probably move somewhere cheaper, maybe to the city where there might be more job opportunities. But Daniel didn't want her to leave. The thought of Saturday mornings without seeing Rebecca and her children made him feel strangely empty. Cedar Ridge was her home. Her children went to school here, had friends here. They shouldn't have to leave everything behind just because life had dealt them a hard blow. Daniel began to realize that simply watching wasn't enough anymore. Rebecca Hayes needed help, and he was in a position to provide it. The question was how to help without making her feel uncomfortable or embarrassed. He'd seen enough proud people in his life to know that charity, no matter how well-intended, could sometimes hurt more than it helped. But watching Rebecca struggle while he had more than enough wasn't something Daniel could continue doing. Something had to change. He just needed to figure out the right way to make it happen. Part 2. Silent Interventions. The idea came to Daniel on a cold Tuesday morning while he was checking on his cattle. The winter was going to be harsh, and families like Rebecca's would struggle even more when heating bills climbed and work became scarce. He couldn't just stand by and watch anymore. Daniel drove into town earlier than usual that day, arriving at Miller's General Store before it opened. Pete Miller was already inside, getting ready for the day, counting the money in his register and arranging the fresh produce that had come in on the morning truck. "Morning, Pete," Daniel said, stepping through the back door that Pete always left open for his early customers. "Well, if it isn't Daniel Walker," Pete smiled, looking up from his work. "You're here mighty early today. Everything all right at the ranch?" Daniel took off his hat and turned it in his hands, a nervous habit he'd had since childhood. "Pete, I need to ask you something, and I need you to keep it between us." Pete's expression grew serious. The Millers had been doing business with the Walkers for decades, and trust was the foundation of that relationship. "You know you can count on me, Daniel." "What's on your mind?" "It's about Rebecca Hayes," Daniel began. "I've been watching her struggle, and it doesn't sit right with me. I want to help, but I don't want her to know it's coming from me." Pete nodded slowly. He'd been thinking the same thing about Rebecca's situation. "That's a kind thought, Daniel. What did you have in mind?" "I want to set up a fund," Daniel explained. "Something that covers her groceries and essentials. Tell her it's from the church or maybe a community assistance program. I'll give you the money and you just make sure she gets what she needs without any questions asked." Pete scratched his chin, thinking it over. "Rebecca's proud, Daniel. She might get suspicious if things seem too easy all of a sudden." "That's why it needs to be gradual," Daniel said. "Start small. Maybe just cover the difference when she has to put items back. Make it seem like there was a mistake in the pricing, or that there's a discount she qualifies for. We'll build up to bigger help slowly. Pete smiled. You've got a good heart, Daniel Walker. Your grandfather would be proud. They shook hands on it, and Daniel left an envelope with enough cash to cover Rebecca's expenses for several months. Pete promised to be careful and natural about how he handled it. The first opportunity came that very Saturday. Rebecca arrived with her 3 children as usual. Daniel watched from across the street, pretending to examine the bulletin board outside the post office. Rebecca went through her normal routine, checking prices and making careful decisions about what to buy. When she got to the counter, Pete totaled her items. Rebecca pulled out her coins, counting them twice as she always did. She was $3 short and started to remove items from her bag. Hold on there, Rebecca, Pete said casually. Looks like these apples are marked wrong. They're supposed to be on sale this week. And the milk. Well, you've got 3 kids. We give a family discount on milk. Let me fix that for you. Pete quickly adjusted the prices, and suddenly Rebecca had enough money for everything in her basket, plus a little extra. She looked confused but grateful. Are you sure about this, Pete? She asked. I don't want to take advantage of any mistake. No mistake at all, Pete assured her. These sales programs change all the time. You qualified fair and square. Daniel watched Rebecca's face light up as she realized she could buy everything she needed. Her youngest son, who had been eyeing the candy display, got a small chocolate bar. Her daughter got the hair ribbons she'd been wanting. These were tiny things, but they made the family so happy. Over the next few weeks, Daniel expanded his help. He learned that Rebecca's teenage son, Michael, was strong and responsible. The boy had been looking for work after school and weekends to help support the family. Daniel had an idea. He drove over to Rebecca's small house on the other side of town. It was modest but well-maintained, with a tiny garden in front and children's toys neatly arranged on the porch. Daniel knocked on the door, his heart beating faster than he expected. Rebecca answered, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Up close, Daniel could see that she was younger than he'd first thought, probably in her early 30s. Her brown eyes were kind but cautious when she saw a stranger at her door. Mrs. Hayes, Daniel said, putting on his best business voice. I'm Daniel Walker. I own the cattle ranch outside of town. Recognition flickered in Rebecca's eyes. She'd probably heard the Walker name around town, even if she didn't know much about the family. How can I help you, Mr. Walker? She asked politely. Well, ma'am, I'm looking for some part-time help at the ranch. Feeding cattle, mending fences, general ranch work. I heard you have a son who might be interested in earning some money after school and on weekends. Rebecca's face brightened immediately. Michael? Yes, he's been looking for work. He's 15, very responsible, and strong for his age. The pay would be $12 an hour, Daniel said. Knowing this was generous for part-time youth work in Cedar Ridge. 20 hours a week to start, maybe more during busy seasons. Rebecca's eyes widened. $24 a week would make a huge difference for their family. That sounds wonderful, Mr. Walker. When could he start? How about Monday after school? I'll pick him up here and drive him back home when we're done each day. When Michael came home from school that afternoon, Rebecca could barely contain her excitement telling him about the job opportunity. The teenager was thrilled. He'd been feeling bad about not being able to help his mother more, and this job would let him contribute to the family finances. Daniel's next step was handling Rebecca's housing situation. He'd learned from Pete that she was behind on rent and the landlord was getting impatient. Her husband's medical bills had eaten up their small savings, and the life insurance payout had barely covered the funeral expenses. Daniel contacted his lawyer, Jim Morrison, who had handled Walker family business for years. Jim knew how to be discreet when needed. I need you to approach Rebecca Hayes' landlord anonymously, Daniel explained. Tell him someone wants to pay her back rent and set up a fund to cover her rent for the next year. Make it seem like it's coming from her husband's former employer or an insurance settlement that just came through. Jim raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. The Walker family had always been involved in community charity work, though usually more openly. If Daniel wanted to help someone quietly, that was his business. Within a week, Rebecca received a visit from Jim Morrison, who explained that her husband's mining company had discovered they owed the families additional compensation. The paperwork had taken months to process, but now she was entitled to a settlement that would cover her housing costs for the foreseeable future. Rebecca cried when she heard the news. She'd been lying awake at night worrying about where she and the children would live if they got evicted. This felt like a miracle. Meanwhile, Michael started working at the Walker Ranch. Daniel made sure to treat the boy fairly, teaching him real ranch skills while keeping the work appropriate for someone his age. Michael was eager to learn and worked harder than most adults Daniel had hired over the years. "Your boy's got a good head on his shoulders," Daniel told Rebecca one evening when he dropped Michael off. "He's learning fast and isn't afraid of hard work." "He gets that from his father," Rebecca said proudly. "David always said that honest work was something to be proud of, no matter what kind it was." Daniel found himself looking forward to these brief conversations with Rebecca. She was always grateful but never excessive about it. She treated him with the same courtesy she showed everyone, not because he was wealthy, but because she was naturally kind. The changes in Rebecca's life were gradual enough that most people in town didn't notice. She seemed a little less stressed, her children appeared happier, and she was able to buy better groceries. But to those who were paying attention, like Daniel, the transformation was remarkable. Rebecca started smiling more. She held her shoulders straighter when she walked. Her children's clothes looked newer, and they seemed more confident at school. The family was still living modestly, but they were no longer struggling to survive. Daniel felt satisfaction in a way he'd never experienced before. Making money for himself had always been straightforward, but using his resources to improve someone else's life gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't known was missing. He was careful never to let Rebecca see him watching, or to make his help too obvious. As far as she knew, a series of fortunate coincidences had improved her family's situation. Her son had found a good job, some delayed insurance money had come through, and the store seemed to have more sales and discounts than usual. But Daniel knew the truth. For the first time in his adult life, his wealth was serving a purpose beyond just accumulating more wealth. He was making a difference in the lives of people who deserved better than what fate had given them. And strangely, helping Rebecca and her family was making him feel more fulfilled than any business success ever had. Part 3. The First Direct Encounter. The storm hit Cedar Ridge on a Wednesday night in early December, bringing with it the kind of wind and rain that reminded everyone just how small they were compared to nature's power. Daniel sat in his big house listening to the weather rage outside, grateful for the solid roof over his head and the warm fire crackling in his stone fireplace. By Thursday morning, the storm had moved on, leaving behind a mess of fallen trees, damaged roofs, and flooded roads. Daniel was up before sunrise checking on his cattle and surveying the damage to his property. A few fence posts had been knocked down, and there was some roof damage to one of the barns. But overall, the Walker Ranch had weathered the storm well. The same couldn't be said for the rest of Cedar Ridge. As Daniel drove into town later that morning with his work crew to check on the community and offer help where needed, he saw the real impact of the storm. Several houses had lost shingles or entire sections of roofing. The old oak tree in the town square had crashed into the library's front steps. Power lines were down in 3 neighborhoods. Daniel's first stop was at Miller's General Store to check on Pete and see if the store had suffered any damage. Pete was outside with a broom, sweeping broken glass from a window that had been shattered by flying debris. "Morning, Pete," Daniel called out as he parked his truck. "How bad is it?" "Could be worse," Pete replied, though his face looked tired. "Lost 2 windows and got some water damage in the back storage room, but we'll manage. The Hendersons lost half their roof, and the Johnsons' basement is flooded. But the worst I heard about is Rebecca Hayes' place." Daniel's stomach dropped. "What happened?" "Tree came down right through her roof," Pete explained, shaking his head. "Crashed into the children's bedroom around 3 in the morning. Thank God nobody was hurt, but the house isn't safe to stay in until repairs are made. Last I heard, she took the kids to the church to wait it out." Without another word, Daniel climbed back into his truck and drove straight to Cedar Ridge Community Church. Pastor Williams was outside directing volunteers who were setting up cots and organizing donated blankets and food for families displaced by the storm. Inside the church, Daniel found Rebecca sitting in a pew near the back, her 3 children huddled close to her. They all looked exhausted and shaken. Rebecca's youngest daughter was asleep with her head in her mother's lap, while the 2 boys sat quietly, their eyes still wide with the shock of being woken up by a tree crashing through their ceiling. Rebecca looked up when she noticed someone approaching. Her face showed surprise when she recognized Daniel Walker, the rancher who employed her son. Mr. Walker, she said softly, trying not to wake her daughter. Michael isn't supposed to work today because of the storm. I'm not here about work, Mrs. Hayes, Daniel replied, his voice gentle. I came to check on families affected by the storm. Are you and the children all right? Rebecca nodded, but Daniel could see the worry in her eyes. We're safe, and that's what matters. The tree missed us by a few feet. We were lucky. What about your house? It's not livable right now, Rebecca admitted. The roof has a huge hole, and there's water damage throughout the children's room and the hallway. Pastor Williams says we can stay here until we figure something out. Daniel looked around the church. It was filled with families in similar situations, all trying to make the best of sleeping on hard pews and cots. Children were restless, babies were crying, and everyone looked uncomfortable and uncertain about what came next. Mrs. Hayes, Daniel said, making a decision that surprised even him. I have a solution if you're willing to consider it. Rebecca looked at him carefully. What kind of solution? I have a guest house on my property that's been empty for months. It has 3 bedrooms, a full kitchen, and a living room. It's completely furnished and ready to move into. You and the children could stay there while your house is being repaired. Rebecca's eyes widened. Mr. Walker, that's very kind of you, but I couldn't possibly accept such generosity. We barely know each other. You know me well enough, Daniel said. I've been employing your son for weeks, and he's told me a lot about his family. You're good people who've had some bad luck. Right now you need a safe place to stay, and I have one sitting empty. It seems like a practical solution. But what would people think? Rebecca asked. A widow and her children staying at an unmarried man's property? Daniel hadn't considered the gossip this might generate. But now that Rebecca mentioned it, he realized she was right to be concerned. Cedar Ridge was a small town where people noticed everything and talked about most of it. The guest house is completely separate from the main house, Daniel explained. It's about 200 yards away with its own driveway and entrance. And my housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, lives in a small apartment above the garage. She'd be nearby if you needed anything or if you were concerned about propriety. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, looking down at her sleeping daughter. Daniel could see her weighing the options in her mind. How long would this arrangement last? She finally asked. As long as you need, Daniel said. House repairs can take time, especially when half the town needs work done at the same time. Could be weeks, could be a couple of months. There's no rush from my end. One of Rebecca's sons, the older one named Michael, who worked at the ranch, had been listening to the conversation. Mom, he whispered, maybe we should think about it. Mr. Walker's place is really nice, and the guest house has its own yard where Katie could play. Rebecca looked at her children's tired faces and then around the crowded church. The storm had left her with limited options, and Daniel's offer solved her immediate housing problem without requiring her to leave Cedar Ridge or pull her children out of school. Mr. Walker, she said slowly, if you're serious about this offer, I'd be very grateful. But I insist on paying rent, and I'd want to help with any chores or work around the property to earn our keep. We can work something out, Daniel agreed, though he had no intention of taking rent money from her. The important thing right now is getting you and the children somewhere comfortable and safe. An hour later, Daniel was driving Rebecca and her children out to the Walker Ranch. The kids pressed their faces against the truck windows, amazed by the size of the property and the number of cattle grazing in the distance. Rebecca sat quietly in the passenger seat, occasionally glancing over at Daniel as if she was still trying to understand why he was helping them. The guest house was more than Rebecca had imagined. It was essentially a small home, with a cozy living room, a well-equipped kitchen, and 3 bedrooms that were simply but comfortably furnished. The children ran from room to room, excited by the space and the novelty of their temporary new home. This is beautiful, Mr. Walker, Rebecca said, running her hand along the smooth wooden kitchen counter. Are you sure we won't be imposing? Not at all, Daniel assured her. To be honest, it's nice to have the place occupied. Empty houses don't do well if they're not lived in. As Daniel showed Rebecca where everything was located, he found himself paying attention to details he'd never noticed before. The way the afternoon light came through the kitchen window, how the living room felt warm and inviting with people in it, the sound of children's laughter echoing through rooms that had been silent for too long. The main house is just up that hill, Daniel pointed out through the front window. If you need anything at all, don't hesitate to ask. And Mrs. Patterson checks on the guest house regularly, so she'll be around if I'm not. That evening, Daniel sat on his own front porch, looking down toward the guest house where warm yellow light glowed from the windows. He could see shadows moving inside, the normal activities of a family settling in for the night. It was a sight that made his large, empty house feel even more quiet than usual. For the first time since he'd started helping Rebecca, Daniel wondered if his motivations were entirely altruistic. Yes, she and her children needed help, and yes, he was in a position to provide it. But if he was completely honest with himself, having Rebecca Hayes living on his property, even temporarily, felt like more than just charity work. Daniel had spent years convinced that he was content with his solitary life. His ranch gave him purpose, his financial success provided security, and his independence meant he didn't have to compromise or consider anyone else's needs. But watching Rebecca tuck her children into bed in the guest house made him realize that contentment and happiness weren't necessarily the same thing. The next morning, Daniel woke up earlier than usual and found himself looking forward to checking on his temporary tenants. He told himself it was just being a good landlord, making sure everything was working properly and that his guests were comfortable. But when he knocked on the guest house door, and Rebecca answered with a genuine smile, offering him coffee and thanking him again for his kindness, Daniel knew his feelings were more complicated than simple charity. For the first time in years, he felt like his life had a different kind of purpose. Taking care of Rebecca and her children felt natural and right in a way that surprised him. The storm had been destructive and traumatic for many families in Cedar Ridge. But for Daniel Walker, it had been the catalyst that finally brought Rebecca Hayes into his life in a meaningful way. Part 4. Under the same sky, living on the Walker Ranch was like stepping into a different world for Rebecca and her children. The first few days were an adjustment period as they learned the rhythms of ranch life. The rooster crowed at dawn, cattle lowed in the distance, and the pace of life felt slower and more peaceful than their busy neighborhood in town. Daniel made it a point to check on his guests every morning, though he tried to be casual about it. He'd walk down from the main house under the pretense of checking fence lines or heading to the barn, always stopping to see if Rebecca needed anything. "Good morning," he'd call out, tipping his hat if she was hanging laundry or tending to the small herb garden that came with the guest house. "Morning, Mr. Walker," Rebecca would reply, always with a smile that seemed to brighten the entire day. The children adapted to ranch life quickly. Katie, the youngest at 6 years old, was fascinated by everything. She followed Daniel around when he'd let her, asking endless questions about the cattle, the horses, and why the sky seemed so much bigger here than it did in town. "Mr. Walker," Katie asked one afternoon while sitting on the fence watching the cattle, "do the cows have names?" Daniel chuckled. "Well, we don't name all of them, Katie, but some of the special ones have names. See that big brown one over there? That's Bessie. She's been on this ranch longer than you've been alive." 8-year-old Tommy was more interested in the practical aspects of ranch work. He wanted to know how the water system worked, why the hay was stored in certain buildings, and how Daniel knew when the cattle needed to be moved to different pastures. "Can I help with chores?" Tommy asked one day. "I'm strong, and I want to learn how to do ranch work like Michael." Daniel was touched by the boy's eagerness. "Tell you what, Tommy, every afternoon after school, if your mother says it's okay, you can help me feed the chickens and collect eggs." "That's an important job." Tommy's face lit up with pride. Having a real responsibility made him feel more grown up and less like a guest who was just taking up space. Michael continued his after-school work. But now, instead of Daniel having to drive to town to pick him up, the teenager was already on the ranch. This made the work arrangement easier and allowed Daniel to give Michael more diverse tasks and training. "Your son has real natural talent with animals," Daniel told Rebecca one evening as they watched Michael expertly guide a stubborn cow back to the herd. "He's got patience and instinct. Those are things you can't teach." "His father was like that too," Rebecca said softly. "David could calm any animal, fix any machine, and solve problems that left other people scratching their heads. Michael definitely got that from him." These conversations were becoming the highlight of Daniel's day. Usually they happened in the early evening when the work was done, and the children were playing in the yard around the guest house. Daniel would find reasons to linger, and Rebecca seemed to enjoy the adult conversation after spending most of her day focused on her children's needs. "You must miss him very much," Daniel said gently, referring to Rebecca's late husband. "Every day," Rebecca admitted. "But it's getting easier to remember the good times without feeling overwhelmed by sadness." For a while after David died, I couldn't even think about our happy memories without crying. Now I can tell the children stories about their father and smile instead of feeling like my heart was breaking. Daniel found himself sharing more about his own life than he had with anyone in years. He told Rebecca about growing up as an only child on the ranch, about the pressure he'd felt to live up to his family's reputation, and about how lonely success could be sometimes. I always thought having more land, more cattle, more money would make me feel complete, Daniel said one evening as they sat on the guest house porch watching the sunset. But lately I've been wondering if I was focusing on the wrong things. What do you think you should have been focusing on? Rebecca asked. Daniel looked at her children playing in the yard, listened to their laughter, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Maybe on building something that matters to more people than just myself. As the weeks passed, Daniel noticed changes in himself that went beyond just enjoying Rebecca's company. He started paying attention to things that had never mattered to him before. Was the guest house warm enough on cold nights? Did the children have everything they needed for school? Was Rebecca getting enough rest, or was she staying up too late worrying about things she couldn't control? One particularly cold evening, Daniel noticed that Katie had been coughing throughout the day. When he knocked on the guest house door to check on the family, he found Rebecca in the kitchen making hot tea with honey. Katie's just got a little cold, Rebecca explained. Nothing serious, but I want to make sure it doesn't get worse. Is there anything she needs? Medicine or maybe a humidifier for her room? Daniel asked. We'll be fine, Rebecca assured him. I used to be a nurse before I had children, so I know how to handle these things. Daniel filed away this new information about Rebecca's background. A nurse. That explained her calm competence in handling minor crises and her natural way of taking care of everyone around her. Later that evening, Daniel found himself thinking about Katie's cough and whether the guest house was humid enough for a child with respiratory congestion. By morning, he'd convinced himself that a humidifier was a practical necessity, not an overreaction. He drove to town and returned with not just a humidifier, but also some children's cough syrup, throat lozenges, and a soft stuffed animal for Katie to cuddle while she recovered. Mr. Walker, this is too much, Rebecca protested when he arrived with his purchases. It's nothing, Daniel said, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. I just want to make sure Katie gets better quickly. That afternoon, Daniel found Katie curled up on the couch with the new stuffed animal, a small brown bear that she'd immediately named Coco. The humidifier was running quietly in her room, and she was already breathing easier. Thank you, Mr. Walker, Katie said in her small, sweet voice. Coco says thank you too. Daniel felt his heart do something strange in his chest. When was the last time such a simple thank you had meant so much to him? The incident with Katie's cold made Daniel realize how invested he'd become in this family's well-being. It wasn't just charity anymore, if it ever had been. He genuinely cared about these people as individuals. Michael's success at learning ranch work made him proud. Tommy's excitement about collecting eggs each day made him smile. Katie's innocent questions and observations delighted him, and Rebecca's presence made everything feel different and better. One evening, Daniel was later than usual checking on the family. When he knocked on the guest house door, Rebecca answered looking more frazzled than he'd ever seen her. Is everything all right? Daniel asked immediately. It's Katie, Rebecca explained. She's been having nightmares about the storm, about the tree crashing through the roof. She's afraid to go to sleep in her room. Daniel could hear crying coming from inside the house. Without thinking about it, he followed Rebecca inside and found Katie sobbing on the couch, inconsolable despite her mother's best efforts to comfort her. Hey there, Katie, Daniel said softly, sitting down near the little girl. What's got you so upset? The tree, Katie hiccuped through her tears. What if another tree falls down and hurts us? Daniel looked at Rebecca, who seemed exhausted by the effort of trying to reassure her daughter that they were safe. Can I tell you a secret, Katie? Daniel said, his voice gentle and calm. I built this house myself with my own hands about 10 years ago. And when I built it, I made sure it was strong enough to keep anyone inside completely safe, no matter what kind of weather came along. Katie's crying slowed as she listened. And see these big oak trees around the house? Daniel continued, pointing out the window. My grandfather planted those trees 60 years ago, and my father trimmed them and took care of them. And now I do the same thing. We make sure they're healthy and strong so they won't fall down. Really? Katie asked, wiping her nose. Really? Daniel confirmed. And if you want, tomorrow I'll show you exactly how we take care of the trees to keep them safe. And would you like that? Katie nodded, finally starting to calm down. But right now, Daniel said, how about I stay here until you fall asleep? I can sit right here in this chair, and if any bad dreams try to bother you, I'll chase them away. Rebecca looked surprised by Daniel's offer, but Katie immediately brightened. You'll stay until I'm asleep? Katie asked. Absolutely, Daniel promised. 20 minutes later, Katie was sleeping peacefully in her bed, and Daniel was sitting quietly in the hallway outside her room. Rebecca brought him a cup of coffee and sat down in the chair next to him. You didn't have to do this, Rebecca whispered. I wanted to, Daniel replied, and he meant it completely. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to Katie's peaceful breathing and the quiet sounds of the ranch at night. She's been through so much, Rebecca said softly. Losing her father, then the storm, now living in a strange place. Sometimes I worry that all these changes are too much for a 6-year-old to handle. She's stronger than you think, Daniel said. All of your children are. They get that from you. Rebecca looked at him with surprise. From me? Part 5. Hearts Revealed. 2 months had passed since the storm, and Rebecca's house in town was finally ready for her family to move back. The contractor had called that morning to say the roof was completely repaired, the water damage had been fixed, and everything was ready for their return. Rebecca should have been excited about going home. Instead, she found herself feeling anxious and sad about leaving the ranch. The guest house had become more than just temporary shelter. It had become a place where her children were happy, where she felt safe and cared for, and where she'd experienced a kind of peace she hadn't known since her husband's death. But it was more than just the comfortable living situation. If Rebecca was honest with herself, the thought of not seeing Daniel every day was what really bothered her. Over the past weeks, she'd come to look forward to their evening conversations, to his gentle way with her children, and to the feeling of security that came from knowing he was nearby. That evening, as she was trying to work up the courage to tell Daniel about the contractor's call, he appeared at her door with news of his own. Rebecca, Daniel said, seeming unusually nervous. I've been thinking about your housing situation, and I have an idea I'd like to run by you. Actually, I need to tell you something too, Rebecca replied. The contractor called today. My house is ready. We can move back any time. Daniel's face fell slightly, though he tried to hide his disappointment. That's wonderful news, he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. Your children must be excited about going home. They are, Rebecca said, though this wasn't entirely true. The children had grown attached to ranch life and weren't eager to leave. But Daniel, what was your idea? Daniel took a deep breath. He'd been planning this conversation for weeks, but now that the moment was here, he felt uncertain about how to proceed. I was going to suggest that you and the children stay permanently, Daniel said. Not as guests, but as part of the ranch family. Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean exactly? I mean that this place feels right with you here, Daniel said, his words coming faster now that he'd started. The ranch has been in my family for 3 generations, but it's never felt like a real home until you and the children arrived. I wake up every morning looking forward to seeing you. I end every day hoping you're happy and comfortable, and I've realized that what I want more than anything is for you to stay. Rebecca stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. Daniel, I know this is sudden, Daniel continued. And I know we come from very different backgrounds. I'm just a rancher who's been alone too long, and you're a woman who's been through more hardship than anyone should have to endure. But these past 2 months have been the happiest of my adult life. Not because of anything I accomplished or any success I achieved, but because I got to be part of your family's daily life. Rebecca felt tears starting to form in her eyes. You're not just a rancher, Daniel. You're the kindest, most generous man I've ever met. But what you're suggesting, people would talk. A widow moving in permanently with a bachelor? In a town like Cedar Ridge? Let them talk, Daniel said firmly. I've spent too many years worrying about what other people think instead of focusing on what would make me happy. You and your children make me happy, Rebecca. You make me want to be better than I am. Daniel, there's something I need to tell you, Rebecca said, her voice shaking slightly. Daniel's heart sank. He was sure she was about to reject his proposal kindly but firmly. For the past few weeks I've been dreading the day I'd have to tell you we were moving back to town, Rebecca continued. Not because I don't appreciate everything you've done for us, but because I can't imagine not seeing you every day. I can't imagine Tommy not collecting eggs every afternoon, or Katie not having you chase away her nightmares, or Michael not learning about ranch life from someone he looks up to so much. Daniel felt a surge of hope. What are you saying? I'm saying that I've fallen in love with this life, Rebecca said. With the peace and beauty of the ranch, with watching my children thrive in ways they never did in town, and she paused, gathering courage for what she needed to say next. And with you, Daniel. I've fallen in love with you. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The words hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable and life-changing. You have? Daniel asked softly. I have, Rebecca confirmed. I didn't plan it, and I certainly didn't expect it. When David died, I thought that part of my life was over forever. I thought I'd never feel that way about another person. But you've been so good to us, so patient and caring and generous. And somewhere along the way, gratitude turned into something much deeper. Daniel stepped closer to her, reaching out to take her hands in his. Rebecca, I've been in love with you since before you even knew who I was. I've been watching you for months, admiring your strength and grace, wishing I could be part of your life. Rebecca looked confused. Watching me for months? But we barely spoke before the storm. Daniel realized he'd revealed more than he intended, but if they were being completely honest with each other, Rebecca deserved to know the truth about how his feelings had developed. There's something I need to confess, Daniel said. My help didn't start with offering you the guest house after the storm. I've been helping your family anonymously for months. What do you mean? Rebecca asked. The discounts at Miller's store, the family assistance programs, the settlement money that covered your rent, Daniel explained. That was all me. I saw you struggling and I couldn't stand by and do nothing. I set up ways to help without you knowing it was coming from me. Rebecca stared at him in shock. You mean all those fortunate coincidences? Weren't coincidences at all, Daniel confirmed. I'm sorry for deceiving you, but I knew you were too proud to accept direct charity. I just wanted to make things easier for you and the children. Rebecca pulled her hands away from his and Daniel's heart sank. He was sure she was angry about the deception. All this time, Rebecca said slowly, I thought we were just experiencing a run of good luck. I thanked God every night for the small miracles that were helping us survive. Rebecca, I'm sorry, Daniel began, but she held up her hand to stop him. Don't apologize, she said, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. Do you have any idea what your help meant to us? There were nights when I lay awake wondering how I was going to feed my children or keep a roof over their heads. Your anonymous generosity saved us when I was too proud to ask for help and too desperate to refuse it. I never wanted you to feel indebted to me, Daniel said. I helped because I cared about you, not because I expected anything in return. I know that, Rebecca said, and that's exactly why I fell in love with you. Not because of what you could give us, but because of who you are. You're a man who sees someone in need and finds a way to help without making them feel small or helpless. You're a man who treats my children like they matter, who makes them feel valued and important. You're a man who has everything he could want materially but still feels like something is missing. You're what was missing, Daniel said. You and Michael and Tommy and Katie. You're the family I never knew I wanted until I found you. Rebecca stepped closer to him, reaching up to touch his face gently. So what do we do now? Now, Daniel said, covering her hand with his, we stop worrying about what anyone else thinks and start building the life we both want. Stay, Rebecca, marry me. Let me be a father to your children and a husband to you. Let's turn this ranch into the home it was always meant to be. Rebecca looked into his eyes and saw nothing but love, sincerity, and hope for their future together. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt like she could truly move forward, not just survive. Yes, she whispered. Yes to all of it. When Daniel kissed her, it felt like the beginning of a new chapter for both of them. The storm that had brought them together had been destructive and frightening, but it had also been the catalyst for finding love when neither of them was looking for it. That night, as Rebecca tucked her children into bed in the guest house that had become their real home, she told them that they wouldn't be moving back to town after all. We're staying on the ranch forever? Katie asked excitedly. Forever, Rebecca confirmed. Mr. Walker wants us to be his family. Like a real dad? Tommy asked hopefully. Like a real dad, Rebecca assured him. Michael, who had been quietly listening from the doorway, smiled wider than Rebecca had seen since before his father's death. Does this mean I get to learn everything about running a ranch? Everything, Rebecca promised. As her children drifted off to sleep happier and more secure than they'd been in over a year, Rebecca looked out the window toward the main house where Daniel lived. Tomorrow they would start making plans for their wedding, for combining their families, and for building a future together. The widow who had once counted coins carefully at the general store was about to become the wife of the richest rancher in 3 counties. But more importantly, the woman who had thought her heart was broken beyond repair had found love again with a man who saw her true worth and chose to cherish it. Part 6. The Town's Judgment. The news of Daniel Walker's engagement to Rebecca Hayes spread through Cedar Ridge faster than a grass fire in August. By Monday morning, less than 48 hours after Daniel had proposed, it seemed like every person in town had heard the story and formed an opinion about it. The first person to confront Rebecca directly was Margaret Whitfield, the widow of the late banker Harrison Whitfield. Margaret had always considered herself the unofficial queen of Cedar Ridge society, and for the past 3 years, she'd made no secret of her interest in Daniel Walker. Rebecca was coming out of Miller's General Store with Katie when Margaret approached, her face stern and her voice loud enough for other shoppers to hear. "Well, Rebecca Hayes," Margaret said, her tone dripping with false sweetness, "I hear congratulations are in order. How quickly you've managed to land on your feet after your recent misfortunes." Rebecca felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she kept her voice calm. "Thank you, Margaret. Daniel and I are very happy." "I'm sure you are," Margaret replied with a knowing smile. "It must be quite a relief to go from counting pennies at the grocery store to having access to the Walker fortune." "Very convenient timing, wouldn't you say?" "Mama, what's she talking about?" Katie asked, tugging on Rebecca's dress. "Nothing important, sweetheart," Rebecca said, taking her daughter's hand firmly. "We need to get home," but Margaret wasn't finished. "I just hope Daniel knows what he's getting himself into. A man in his position needs to be careful about people who might be more interested in his bank account than his heart." Several other shoppers had gathered around, pretending to examine merchandise while listening to every word. Rebecca could feel their eyes on her, could sense them whispering among themselves. "My feelings for Daniel have nothing to do with his money," Rebecca said firmly. "And I don't appreciate the implication otherwise." "Of course not, dear," Margaret said patronizingly. "I'm sure it's just a coincidence that you fell in love with the richest man in 3 counties, right when you needed financial security the most." Rebecca wanted to defend herself, to explain how their relationship had really developed. But she realized that anything she said would just fuel more gossip. Instead, she simply said, "I hope you have a pleasant day, Margaret," and walked away with Katie. But the encounter with Margaret was just the beginning. Over the next several days, Rebecca faced similar confrontations throughout town. At the post office, the clerk made snide comments about some people's luck. At the church, several women who had previously been friendly now seemed cool and distant. Even at Katie's school, Rebecca noticed other mothers whispering when she arrived to pick up her daughter. The worst came when Rebecca overheard a conversation at the bank. She was waiting in line to close her old account and transfer everything to a joint account with Daniel, when she heard 2 women talking behind her. "It's shameful, really," one woman said, "taking advantage of a man's kindness like that. Poor Daniel probably felt sorry for her and got trapped into marriage. She's been planning this from the start," the other woman replied, "moving her family onto his property, letting her children wrap him around their little fingers. It's calculated, if you ask me. And now she'll have access to everything the Walker family built over 3 generations. It's not right." Rebecca's hands shook as she filled out the banking forms. These women didn't know her, didn't understand her relationship with Daniel, and didn't care about the truth. They'd already decided she was a gold digger, and nothing would change their minds. That evening, Daniel found Rebecca sitting on the guest house porch, looking more troubled than he'd seen her since the night of the storm. "What's wrong?" he asked immediately, sitting down beside her. Rebecca told him about the encounter she'd been having around town, about the whispers and accusations and cold shoulders. "People think I'm marrying you for your money," she said sadly. They think I'm taking advantage of your kindness. Daniel felt anger rise in his chest. What people think doesn't matter, Rebecca. We know the truth about our feelings for each other. But it does matter, Rebecca argued. You have to live in this community. Your business depends on relationships with these people. I don't want to hurt your reputation or make people think less of you. My reputation can handle some gossip, Daniel said firmly. What I can't handle is the thought of losing you because of what small-minded people might say. Maybe we should wait, Rebecca suggested. Let some time pass, let people get used to the idea gradually. Absolutely not, Daniel said. Rebecca, I've waited my whole adult life to find someone like you. I'm not waiting another day because Margaret Whitfield and her cronies don't approve. Despite Daniel's reassurances, the social pressure continued to mount. At the monthly town council meeting, several longtime business associates made pointed comments about the importance of maintaining community standards and being careful about outside influences. The pastor of Cedar Ridge Community Church, Reverend Matthews, even requested a private meeting with Daniel to discuss concerns some parishioners have raised. Daniel, Reverend Matthews said during their meeting, I want you to know that I support your right to marry whomever makes you happy. But some members of the congregation are worried about the appearance of impropriety. What appearance of impropriety? Daniel asked bluntly. Well, Rebecca and her children have been living on your property for months and now suddenly there's an engagement. Some people are questioning the timeline and wondering if this relationship started before it should have. Daniel stood up abruptly. Reverend, with all due respect, Rebecca Hayes is one of the most moral, decent people I've ever known. Anyone questioning her character or suggesting something inappropriate has happened doesn't know what they're talking about. I believe you, Daniel. But perception can be as damaging as reality in a small town. Then maybe this small town needs to examine its tendency to judge people it doesn't really know, Daniel replied. The pressure reached its peak when Rebecca's landlord in town, Carl Jenkins, approached her at the post office with what he claimed was a concerned warning. Rebecca, Carl said, I've been hearing talk around town and I thought you should know. People are saying Daniel Walker might be having second thoughts about this engagement, that maybe he's realizing he got caught up in feeling sorry for you and your kids. Rebecca felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. Who's saying that? Well, I can't name names, but it's coming from people who know the Walker family well. They're saying Daniel's been isolated on that ranch too long and maybe he's confused sympathy with love. That evening, Rebecca was quiet during dinner, barely touching her food while her children chattered about their day. After they went to bed, she sat on the porch waiting for Daniel's usual evening visit, dreading the conversation they needed to have. When Daniel arrived, he could immediately sense something was wrong. Carl Jenkins thinks you might be having second thoughts about marrying me, Rebecca said without preamble. Daniel's jaw tightened. Carl Jenkins is an idiot who should mind his own business. But what if he's right? Rebecca asked. What if you're confusing sympathy with love? What if you proposed because you felt obligated after everything you've done for us? Daniel sat down and turned to face her fully. Rebecca, look at me. Do you really believe that? Rebecca met his eyes and saw nothing but love and certainty there. No, she admitted. But sometimes I wonder if I'm being selfish by accepting your proposal when it's causing you so much trouble. The only trouble it's causing me is having to listen to people who don't know us make assumptions about our relationship, Daniel said. But you know what the real problem is? These people have watched you struggle for months and instead of helping or showing compassion, they stood by and did nothing. Now that someone has stepped up to take care of you and your children, they're critical and suspicious. Maybe they're just looking out for you, Rebecca suggested. No, Daniel said firmly. If they were really looking out for me, they'd be happy that I found someone who makes me a better man. They'd see how much happier I am now than I was when I was alone. They'd notice how well you treat me and how much joy your children bring to my life. Daniel took Rebecca's hands in his. I need you to understand something. I don't care if the whole town disapproves of our marriage. I don't care if they whisper and gossip and make up stories about our relationship. The only opinions that matter to me are yours and mine. And the children's, Rebecca added. The children are thrilled, Daniel pointed out. They've been asking me every day when we're getting married and whether they can call me Dad after the wedding. Rebecca smiled for the first time all day. Katie asked me if she gets to help plan the wedding. And Tommy wants to know if he can wear a cowboy hat with his wedding clothes. See? Daniel said. The people whose opinions actually matter are completely supportive. Everyone else can adjust their attitudes or keep their thoughts to themselves. That night, as Rebecca tucked her children into bed, she realized that Daniel was right. The criticism and gossip were hurtful, but they weren't more important than the happiness she'd found with Daniel, or the security and love her children were experiencing for the first time since their father's death. Part 7, Standing Together. The Cedar Ridge Harvest Festival had been a town tradition for over 50 years. Every October, the community gathered in the town square for games, food booths, live music, and the crowning of the Harvest Queen. It was the biggest social event of the year, and everyone who was anyone in Cedar Ridge attended. Daniel had been going to the Harvest Festival since he was a child, usually making a brief appearance to maintain his family's community, standing before retreating back to the ranch. This year was different. This year, he wanted to attend as Rebecca's fiancé and show the entire town that he was proud of his choice and unashamed of their relationship. Are you sure about this? Rebecca asked as they got ready for the festival. It's going to be the whole town in one place. Everyone who's been talking about us will be there. Exactly, Daniel said, adjusting his tie in the mirror, which is why it's the perfect opportunity to make something clear to everyone at once. Rebecca looked beautiful in a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes. She'd borrowed earrings from Mrs. Patterson, Daniel's housekeeper, who had become a strong supporter of the upcoming marriage. The children were excited about the festival, especially Tommy, who was looking forward to the pie-eating contest. When the Walker family arrived at the festival, the reaction was immediate. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, heads turned, and whispers began. Daniel kept his arm around Rebecca's waist, making it clear to everyone that they were together, and he wasn't hiding their relationship. Mr. Walker, Katie called out, tugging on his jacket. Can we go see the animals in the petting zoo? Of course we can, Daniel replied, smiling down at her. Lead the way. As they walked through the festival grounds, Daniel made a point of stopping to talk to people he'd known for years. He introduced Rebecca and her children to everyone they encountered, his tone warm and proud. Jim, I'd like you to meet my fiancée, Rebecca Hayes. And her children, Daniel said to Jim Morrison, his lawyer. Rebecca, Jim's been handling Walker family legal matters for 20 years. Jim Morrison had the good grace to be genuinely welcoming. It's a pleasure to meet you, Rebecca. Daniel's told me wonderful things about you and your family. Some people responded positively, genuinely happy to see Daniel so content. Others were politely distant, maintaining social courtesy while making their disapproval clear through cold smiles and brief conversations. The tension came to a head at the pie auction, a festival tradition where local women donated homemade pies to be auctioned off to raise money for the church. Rebecca had spent the morning baking her grandmother's famous apple pie recipe, wanting to contribute something meaningful to the community event. When the auctioneer called up Rebecca's pie, the bidding started slowly. A few polite offers came from men whose wives had nudged them to participate, but then Margaret Whitfield made a comment loud enough for half the crowd to hear. I wonder if the pie is as sweet as the deal she got landing Daniel Walker, Margaret said to the women standing near her. Several people gasped at the cruel comment. Rebecca felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, and she started to move toward the back of the crowd to escape the attention. But Daniel had heard Margaret's words too. Without hesitation, he stepped forward and raised his hand. $500, Daniel called out clearly. The entire crowd went silent. $500 was more money than the pie auction usually raised for the entire event. Did I hear $500? The auctioneer asked, clearly surprised. You did? Daniel confirmed, his voice carrying across the now quiet festival grounds. And before anyone wonders why I'd pay so much for one pie, let me tell you. The crowd waited, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Rebecca Hayes makes the best apple pie in 3 counties, Daniel said, looking directly at Margaret Whitfield as he spoke. But more importantly, she's the finest woman I've ever known. She's raised 3 wonderful children, while facing challenges that would have broken most people. She's shown grace, strength, and dignity in circumstances that would have left others bitter and defeated. Daniel's voice grew stronger as he continued. I'm not marrying Rebecca Hayes because I feel sorry for her. I'm marrying her because she makes me want to be a better man. Because she's brought joy and purpose to my life in ways I never thought possible. Because her children have taught me what it means to be part of a real family. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Some of you seem to think Rebecca is marrying me for my money, Daniel continued. Let me set the record straight. Rebecca Hayes would have married me if I didn't have a penny to my name, because she loves me for who I am, not what I own, and I know this because I've watched her turn down easier paths, refuse help she desperately needed, and maintain her dignity even when it cost her dearly. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Rebecca, he said, turning to face her directly. I had planned to do this privately, but I think this is exactly the right time and place. Rebecca's eyes widened as Daniel dropped to one knee in front of the entire town. Rebecca Hayes, Daniel said loudly enough for everyone to hear. You are the love of my life and the answer to prayers I didn't even know I was praying. Will you marry me? Rebecca looked around at the crowd of people who had been whispering about her for weeks. Some faces showed genuine emotion at Daniel's romantic gesture. Others still looked skeptical, but in that moment none of it mattered except the man kneeling before her with love shining in his eyes. Yes, she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. Yes, of course I'll marry you. The crowd erupted in applause as Daniel slipped the ring onto Rebecca's finger and stood to kiss her. Even some of the people who had been most critical seemed moved by the obvious sincerity of Daniel's proposal. Katie and Tommy cheered loudly, while Michael beamed with pride at seeing his mother so happy. Mrs. Patterson, who had been watching from nearby, wiped tears from her eyes. After the formal proposal, Daniel wasn't finished making his point. He addressed the crowd one more time. I want everyone here to know that Rebecca and her children aren't just joining the Walker family, he said. They are the Walker family now. These children will carry the Walker name, inherit Walker land, and continue the family tradition of contributing to this community. And anyone who has a problem with that is welcome to discuss it with me directly. The message was clear and unmistakable. Daniel Walker was claiming Rebecca and her children as his own, and he wouldn't tolerate any disrespect toward his new family. As the festival continued, the atmosphere around the Walker family changed noticeably. People who had been keeping their distance began approaching with genuine congratulations. Children from Katie and Tommy's school classes came over to see Rebecca's engagement ring. Even some of the women who'd been most vocal in their criticism seemed to soften their attitudes. Pete Miller, who had been watching the entire scene unfold, approached the family with a huge smile. Daniel, Pete said, that was the finest thing I've seen at a harvest festival in all my years. And Rebecca, that apple pie better be as good as this man claims because I bid $300 on it. You bid on my pie? Rebecca asked, surprised. Right after Daniel bid $500, Pete explained. Figure I should support the lady who's making my best customer so happy. By the end of the evening, Rebecca felt completely different than she had when the day started. Instead of hiding from gossip and criticism, she was standing proudly beside the man she loved, wearing his ring, and planning their future together. Margaret Whitfield made one final attempt to undermine the celebration, approaching Daniel as the festival was winding down. I hope you know what you're doing, Daniel, Margaret said coldly. Some decisions can't be undone easily. Daniel looked at Margaret with the kind of calm confidence that came from absolute certainty about his choices. Margaret, Daniel said evenly, I've never been more sure of anything in my life. And the next time you feel like sharing your opinions about my fiancé, remember that you're talking about the future Mrs. Walker. I'd suggest you show her the respect that position deserves. Margaret huffed and walked away, but Daniel's message had been heard by everyone within earshot. As they drove home to the ranch that night, Rebecca looked at the ring sparkling on her finger and felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in over a year. Thank you, she said to Daniel softly. For what? For standing up for us. For making it clear to everyone that you're proud to be with me. For not letting anyone make you doubt your decision. Daniel reached over and took her hand. Rebecca, I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to doubt how much you mean to me. Today was just the beginning. In the back seat, the children were already planning the wedding, chattering excitedly about flowers and cake and whether they could have the ceremony on the ranch. Can we have horses at the wedding? Katie asked sleepily. We can have anything you want at the wedding, Daniel promised, and for the first time since their relationship began, Rebecca believed that everything was going to work out exactly as it should. Part 8. claimed and claiming. The morning of November 15th dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of autumn sunshine that made everything look golden and perfect. Rebecca woke up in the guest house for the last time as Rebecca Hayes. Tomorrow morning, she would wake up in the main ranch house as Rebecca Walker. She had chosen to keep the wedding simple but meaningful. The ceremony would take place on the ranch, in the meadow overlooking the valley where Daniel's great-grandfather had first built his home. Pastor Matthews would officiate, despite his earlier concerns about community opinion. The reception would be held in the big barn, which had been cleaned and decorated with fall flowers and twinkling lights. What made the wedding special wasn't the decorations or the location, though. It was Daniel's decision to invite the entire town of Cedar Ridge. Every family, every business owner, every person who had whispered or gossiped or questioned their relationship received an invitation to celebrate their marriage. "Are you sure about inviting everyone?" Rebecca had asked when Daniel suggested it weeks earlier. "Absolutely," Daniel had replied. "I want every person in Cedar Ridge to see how proud I am to call you my wife. I want them to witness the beginning of our life together, and I want them to understand that the Hayes children are now Walker children, with all the respect and protection that name carries in this community." Rebecca's wedding dress had been her grandmother's, carefully preserved and altered to fit perfectly. It was simple ivory silk with delicate lace sleeves and a modest train. Mrs. Patterson had helped with the alterations and insisted on lending Rebecca a pearl necklace that had belonged to Daniel's mother. "She would have loved you," Mrs. Patterson said as she fastened the necklace around Rebecca's neck. She always worried that Daniel would end up alone on this big ranch. She'd be so happy to see him with a woman who loves him for who he is and children who bring such life to this place. Katie served as flower girl, wearing a pale yellow dress that made her look like a little princess. Tommy and Michael wore matching dark suits with cowboy boots, a compromise that honored both the formal nature of the occasion and their new ranch lifestyle. Michael had asked Daniel privately if he could be part of the wedding ceremony in a special way. "I'd like to say something during the service," Michael had said, "about what it means to have you as our new father." Daniel had been so moved by the request that he'd barely been able to speak. "Michael, that would mean the world to me." As the guests began arriving for the afternoon ceremony, Rebecca was amazed by how many people came. Nearly the entire population of Cedar Ridge was there, along with ranchers and business associates from neighboring counties. Even Margaret Whitfield attended, though she maintained a dignified distance. Pete Miller and his wife had closed the general store for the day to attend. The banker who had once questioned Rebecca's motives brought his entire family. Teachers from the children's school, neighbors from their old street in town, and people Rebecca had never even spoken to came to witness the wedding. "Look at all these people," Katie whispered as she peeked out the window of the main house where the bridal party was getting ready. "They're here because they care about Mr. Walker," Rebecca explained, "and because this is how our community celebrates important moments together." When it was time for the ceremony to begin, Daniel took his place at the altar that had been set up in the meadow. He looked handsome and confident in his dark suit, but Rebecca could see the emotion in his eyes as he waited for his bride to appear. Pastor Matthews had agreed to include some special elements in the ceremony. After the traditional vows, Michael stepped forward to speak on behalf of his siblings. "Mr. Walker," Michael said, his young voice carrying clearly across the meadow, "you've been more than just my boss and my mom's fiancé. You've been the father we needed when we thought we'd never have one again. You've shown us what it means to be part of a real family, where people take care of each other and nobody gets left behind." Michael paused, collecting himself before continuing. "My dad would have liked you. He would have been grateful that you're taking such good care of us. Tommy and Katie and I, we want you to know that we're proud to become Walkers. We're proud to be your children." There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd as Michael returned to his place. Daniel had to take a moment to compose himself before he could continue with the ceremony. When Pastor Matthews asked if anyone had reasons why Daniel and Rebecca should not be married, the silence was complete and supportive. Whatever doubts or criticisms people had harbored seemed to have been set aside in the face of the obvious love and commitment they were witnessing. "You may kiss your bride," Pastor Matthews announced, and when Daniel and Rebecca kissed, the entire crowd erupted in celebration. Cheers applause. and even a few whoops from the cowboys in attendance filled the autumn air. The reception in the barn was magical. Mrs. Patterson and several other women from the church had outdone themselves with the food. There was dancing to a local country band, speeches from old friends, and enough cake to feed twice as many people as were there. During the father-daughter dance, Daniel danced first with Rebecca, then with Katie, then surprised everyone by asking Mrs. Patterson to dance as well. "She's been like a mother to me for 15 years, Daniel explained to the crowd. "It's only right that she gets to celebrate this day too." As the evening progressed, Rebecca noticed something wonderful happening. People who had been coolest to her over the past months were approaching with genuine warmth. Women who had whispered about her motives were complimenting her dress and asking about her children. Men who had questioned Daniel's judgment were shaking his hand and welcoming Rebecca to the community. Margaret Whitfield even approached Rebecca during the reception, though her manner remained somewhat stiff. "You look lovely, Rebecca," Margaret said formally. "I hope you'll be very happy." "Thank you, Margaret," Rebecca replied graciously. "I hope we can be friends." Margaret's expression softened slightly. "Perhaps we can. Daniel certainly seems devoted to you." It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was a start toward peaceful coexistence in their small community. The highlight of the reception came when Daniel stood to make a toast. The barn fell silent as everyone waited to hear what the groom had to say. "Friends and neighbors," Daniel began. "A year ago, I thought I had everything a man could want. A successful ranch, financial security, and the respect of my community. But I was wrong. I had everything except the most important thing of all, a family to share it with." Daniel looked at Rebecca, his eyes shining with love. "Rebecca didn't just marry me today. She saved me from a life of loneliness I didn't even realize I was living. And her children didn't just get a stepfather today. They got someone who loves them as much as if they'd been mine from birth." The crowd murmured approval as Daniel continued. "Some of you know that Rebecca and her family came to live on my ranch after the storm damaged their house. What you might not know is that having them there changed everything about how that ranch felt. Suddenly, it wasn't just a business or a piece of property. It was a home. It was a place where children's laughter echoed through the halls, where someone waited for me to come back at the end of each day, where I had a reason to build something that would last beyond my own lifetime." Daniel raised his glass. "So I want to thank all of you for being here to witness the beginning of the Walker family's next chapter. And I want to make a promise to my wife and children. Everything I have, everything I am, and everything I ever will be is yours. You'll never want for anything. You'll never face any challenge alone. And you'll never have to doubt how much you're loved." The toast brought tears to many eyes and thunderous applause from the crowd. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, many stopped to shake Daniel's hand and hug Rebecca goodbye. The message was clear. The community had accepted Rebecca Walker and her children as full members of Cedar Ridge Society. Late that night, after the last guest had gone home and the children were asleep in their new rooms in the main house, Daniel and Rebecca sat on their front porch looking out over the ranch that was now truly their shared home. "How do you feel, Mrs. Walker?" Daniel asked, taking Rebecca's hand. "Complete," Rebecca said without hesitation. "For the first time since David died, I feel like our family is whole again. Different than before, but whole." "The children seem happy with the change," Daniel observed. "They are. Katie's already redecorated her new room twice. Tommy's planning to start a vegetable garden in the spring. And Michael told me tonight that he wants to study agriculture in college so he can help run the ranch someday." Daniel smiled. "This ranch will be his someday if he wants it. All of this will belong to our children when we're gone." "Our children," Rebecca repeated softly. "I love the sound of that." 6 months later, Rebecca Walker was a completely different woman than the widow who had once counted coins at Miller's General Store. She'd grown into her role as the wife of Cedar Ridge's most prominent rancher, hosting dinner parties for visiting cattle buyers and organizing charity events for the church. But the changes went deeper than social status. Rebecca had rediscovered parts of herself she thought were lost forever. She was confident again, quick to laugh,